Jones, and welcome to the second ever Lives at Stake, a series of monthly discussions on critical issues facing trans and gender nonconforming communities across the United States. We launched last month, and they still let us on the air. Lives at Stake is a joint production of WNYC's The Green Space, where I am a journalist in residence, and my project Translash. Feel free to go to translash.org and thegreenspace.org to sign up for our newsletters and to follow our work. Today's program continues our examination of the impact of the coronavirus on trans and gender nonconforming people, but through the lens of sex work. Sex work is a vital lifeline and source of income for trans people. 1 out of 10 trans people have engaged in sex work, according to a survey by the National Center for Transgender Equality. And for women of color, trans women of color, that number is up to 4 out of 10 who have done so. Now, people engage in sex work not only because of economic and educational marginalization, but also for some, it gives a sense of empowerment and control over how they earn. But with coronavirus and specifically lockdowns and social distancing, that vital lifeline is cut. And compounding the problem is the fact that government aid, because of criminalization, is not available to trans sex workers and sex workers overall, meaning that the government programs that are keeping people afloat aren't available. So all of this raises the question of whether or not sex work needs to be decriminalized or even legalized. Helping us to unpack this really complex and critical issue is Aria Sa'id, who is Executive Director of the Transgender District, the first ever trans historic district in the country. Cecilia Gentili, she's Argentinian, it's Italian, who is on the steering committee of Decrim in New York and also principal at the Transgender Equity Consulting Group. Toni-Michelle Williams, who is the Executive Director of Solutions, Not Punishment Collaborative in Atlanta, Georgia, and New York State Senator Jessica Ramos, who has introduced legislation to decriminalize sex work across the state of New York. Now, the Green Space is actually a space, and as I said last time, normally we would be there and we would have a live audience in addition to the virtual audience that we have today, but I'm still looking out on you, well, virtually, but actually at my bathroom. We look forward to actually welcoming you to the Green Space once all of this, gets out of the way. Now, since this is a virtual program, however, we're really relying upon your comments and your questions. Now, since the topic is sex work, I'm sure that you will have lots of those. Please put those on all of our various sites, social media, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, using the hashtag Lives at Stake and Translash, and we will fold your questions and comments into the program. We really need y'all to do that. Now, because, again, we are continuing to unpack really heavy, complicated issues, we always like to start this program with a little lightness, with some gifs and memes that have come across our various channels and our social media pages that we like to share and that are getting us through in this moment. It's probably kind of one of the only things. So first up today is one of the don't rush challenges, where people look busted and then they, cover up the screen and then all of a sudden they don't look busted anymore. And this one, of course, is focused on trans men and transmasculine men. I particularly liked that one. It was on the Translash page. I'm a single woman. I'm at home during quarantine. You do the math. But it's particularly important for visibility of transmasculine people, so we wanted to showcase that. Now, the next one is dealing with the backlash against coronavirus all across the country. I don't know if you all saw the very interesting interview last night with Anderson Cooper and the mayor of Las Vegas, but these people in front of us join her in wanting to be an experiment to see what would happen if we end quarantine too early. If coronavirus was a social media page, it would like this. I always say that coronavirus thrives off of ignorance and crowds, and they're doing both. And the last one up, I don't know if you all saw or followed the epic battle between the 1990s and early 2000s Titans, R&B Titans of Teddy Riley and Babyface. It took them, I don't know, 40 times to actually figure out how to do it via Instagram. It wasn't really out when they were hot and popping, but they finally did it. But for some reason, Teddy Riley still couldn't figure out how to operate sound on Instagram, and so you can see that the sound people are trying to figure it out, while Babyface looks like Lucius Lyons, understanding that he has won the battle. So continue to send us those gifts and means. We will include them as we move forward throughout our program. It's kind of one of my favorite parts of the show. Before we turn to the main part of our conversation, I wanted to specify the two terms that we will be using tonight: criminalization versus legalization. Criminalization refers to ending the arrest, prosecutions, and enforcement of activities which are technically illegal. And legalization means bringing activities under protection of the force of the law. So we will be talking about that in light of sex work decriminalization. The other thing I wanted to specify is that tonight, 3 out of 4 of our guests, Aria, Cecilia, and Toni-Michelle, are all former sex workers. And the reason why I specify that is that we got some questions online about whether or not we were going to include the perspectives of people who are sex workers. For some reason, people looked at the bios and the pictures of all of the women on tonight and somehow concluded that they couldn't have been or were not in any way representative of sex workers. And so we wanted to be sure to let you know that at the top of the program, that people know what they're talking about. Now, on to the heart of our program, starting with Aria Sa'id. As I mentioned, Aria Sa'id is the executive director of the Transgender District, the first ever trans historic district in the world. She is also the former director of policy and programs at the St. James Infirmary, the first ever sex worker-led, trans-led health clinic in the country. She's also held a bunch of posts in San Francisco government. Aria is just a dynamo and goes by the pronouns of she and her. Aria, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here tonight.
You look so good. I think it's because secretly you are a skin care queen. People don't know that in addition to all of the things that we mentioned about you at the top of the program, you're also great for giving like skincare tips. So it clearly shows. I wanted to just start out before we get into the heart of our discussion, just to ask how you are doing right now and how you are getting through in this moment.
I'm doing as good as can be, all things considered.
Yeah, all things considered is a huge qualifier for us all. Can you just talk about what the Transgender District is and how it came about? I think, first of all, just in terms of setting the table, Trans Historic District is something that people haven't contemplated exists. And so can you just talk a little bit about how it came about and what it does?
Yeah, so the Transgender District is based in San Francisco's Tenderloin neighborhood in the southeastern region. And for those mostly on the East Coast, I imagine, San Francisco's Tenderloin has one of the densest populations of transgender people of any other neighborhood in San Francisco and perhaps the country. And so in 2016, myself and Janetta Johnson, who's the executive director of TGI Justice Project, and Honey Mahogany, who is a former RuPaul Drag Race contestant and is a drag artist and politician now in San Francisco. We all worked within a coalition of Black trans women towards the founding of the world's first transgender district, although we didn't know that it would be the world's first. And so that's how our fight began. a small history bit is that in August 1966, the Compton's cafeteria riots took place on Turk and Taylor in San Francisco's Tenderloin, and it was a riot led by trans people and drag queens and queer folk. And it's the first documented queer and trans uprising in United States history. And other riots would soon follow, such as Stonewall riots in 1969, Cooper's Donuts, etc. And so we are a project that focuses on anti-displacement of trans people, promoting the social, cultural, and economic empowerment for trans people living in the neighborhood, and community development and urban beautification.
Amazing. One of the things that you're really intent about at the Transgender District is preserving the history and the role of sex workers in our community and in our history. Can you just talk about why you do that, and just in general, just give people an understanding of why sex work is such an important factor and plays an important role for trans communities, why it's not marginal?
Yeah, so sex work is the oldest job in world history since the beginning of time. And for trans people, specifically trans people of color, sex work is often the only source of income that we have when we live our lives authentically. And so for me personally, as a Black trans woman, specifically as a Black trans teenager, when I transitioned, I struggled in gaining sort of traditional employment. And it's not because I didn't apply anywhere. It's not because I didn't interview. It's just because, I guess the word that we would use now is transphobia, that I was very limited in my economic opportunities to survive. And so for me and so many of my sisters that I know, we engaged in survival sex trade because that's all that was available to us to survive. And so I think sex work is often a conversation that sometimes gets put on the back burner by trans community, partly because of stigma of sex work, where there is an assumption that all trans people are engaging in the sex trade. And some in our community would, hope that we would all sort of transition from the sex trade, but it is definitely a reality that so many trans people are facing, and in particular, Black and Brown trans women. And so for the Transgender District, I think everyone on our team is a former sex worker. And a lot of the community members that we engage with, and the community and the residents, the transgender residents of our neighborhood, are active or inactive in sex work. And so it's a big part of our lives and a big issue that we try to address in our social justice work in particular.
Mm-hmm. And also you've worked on changing laws in California. And I also think that just, one thing to note in your personal history is that you were in college at the time, right? So it wasn't as if, you didn't have the ability to be able to get other types of employment. It really was, as you say, the impediment of transphobia. One of the things that the Transgender District has done in response to COVID-19, one of the very first things, it was one of the first mutual aid projects that I saw in response, was heavily focused on sex workers. Can you talk about what some of the needs that you are seeing amongst sex workers in this moment? Like, what are some of the granular day-to-day needs that people are facing right now due to the crisis?
Yeah, so thank you, Imara. We started the COVID-19 relief fund that we did in the way that we did, which was providing cash grants, specifically because we wanted trans people to have ultimate discretion and what they needed for themselves. But what we have gathered so far from nearly 100 people who have filled out the survey and received some form of aid from us is that there is obviously catastrophic loss of income for a lot of people, especially in the service industry, but also in the sex trade. And a lot of sex workers are still trying to work, even with shelter in place mandates, because it is their only source of income. And so, when we think about how the economy works in America in particular, we think, 6 million people applied for unemployment. But those are the people that, had previous sort of documented work history. Many of the trans people that we're working with, they're not eligible for unemployment. They're not eligible for state disability insurance or any windfall support money. The only thing they might be eligible for is the stimulus from the federal government. When we're talking about getting COVID testing and things like that, or access to medications, that works if you have healthcare. If you don't have healthcare, then where do you go? And so a lot of sex workers are having to sort of use the free clinics that are locally based in San Francisco in hopes that they'll get some of that support and those resources. But generally, people are reporting that they need money to pay rent, money to buy groceries, food, supplies, toiletries. There's, of course, been fights breaking out at the grocery stores for toilet paper and the last of the baby wipes. And everyone else is part of that as well. And so getting those things to themselves obviously requires monetary resources.
Right. Well, monetary resources and boxing gloves, maybe. What if maybe they can buy them with the cash help? One last question that I have for you. You've done a really good job of contextualizing. I'm wondering if you can just tell us what is the one thing that you would want people who are not sex workers, who are unfamiliar with sex work, to understand about the people who are and what the needs are?
Sorry, the last it's about people who are and the people that.
Yeah, so what would you say to people who are totally unfamiliar with sex work, who don't know anything about sex workers, to know and understand about the people who are?
Yeah, so I think people should know that there is often this idea that women and femmes and trans people are sort of victimized in the sex trade, right? And so oftentimes in the media and in major media that we see today, the term that we have access to is human trafficking. And so there is this idea and this sort of landscape that promotes that as sex workers, you don't have body autonomy, and that you are sort of flesh peddled and victimized in the sex trade industry. And oftentimes, when those laws come into play and are enforced, they target the low-hanging fruit, which is voluntary sex workers who are engaged either in the sex trades by choice or because of survival. And so many trans people would obviously fall under the survival sex work category. And so I think there needs to be more broader public discussion on the nuances of who engages in sex work, because it's so many different people and for so many different reasons, whether it be survival or you're in graduate school or you believe in choice of what you do with your body. And yeah, the ultimate thing that the broader public should know is that sex worker rights are human rights. And that often there is always a quiet war between sort of government and law enforcement and sex workers and sort of who gets criminalized in that way. And I think the discussion has to think about who is most impacted when we think about sex work. And so there's a lot of times the romanticism that happens around sex work, and it's always like the white redhead woman who's a peekaboo dancer or what have you. And there are many women like that, but most impacted are Black, trans, and cis women who are doing survival street-based sex work, because they are the ones that are being criminalized and incarcerated. They are the ones that are most vulnerable in that way. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Aria, for your important and historic and groundbreaking work. I want to thank you for taking the time to come on tonight. I love and heart you too. I'm holding an iPad, so I can't do it. But I want to thank you for coming on tonight and for everything that you do and that you give. And we will, as I say, continue to follow your historic and groundbreaking work. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was Aria Sa'id, who is the Executive Director of the Transgender District, the first ever trans historic district in the country. You are watching Lives at Stake. Tonight we are talking about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on sex workers and why that's so important for trans and gender nonconforming communities. You can follow the discussion on all of our social media channels. Make sure that you use the hashtag Lives at Stake or Translash and Translash so that we can be sure to pick up your questions and comments and fold them in. And right now we're going to do just that. One person just asked, Christopher Phillips just asked if Compton is a part of the name of the historic transgender district, if that has to do with the Compton riots of 1966. Yes, it does. But as Aria would tell you, if she was still on, they recently decided to move that from the formal name because the person that owned the cafeteria was racist, and they don't want that to be a part of the name of a historic district that is focuses heavily on people of color. And one other person, Leslie Joy Allen, said, just as a comment, that it is time to make sex work legal because we punish the women who are forced to do this work in order to survive. So thank you for those questions and comments. Make sure that you continue to bring them forward. Right now, I wanted to go on to our next guest, who is Cecilia Gentili, who is on the steering committee of Decrim New York and also a principal at Transgender Equity Consulting. Cecilia and I are also on the board of New Pride Agenda, so I wanted to be sure to disclose that. Cecilia will talk to us about the effort to decriminalize sex work in New York State through Decrim New York, which is a grassroots organization of sex workers, former sex workers, and allies who are pushing to demarginalize trans sex workers and sex work overall in New York State. Here's my conversation earlier today with Cecilia.
Thank you for having me.
So first off, before we get into the complicated issues that we're going to unpack, I just wanted to first of all ask how you're doing in this particular moment. How are you getting through?
Well, it has been hard. You know, I am you know, such a social butterfly, and you know, not having, you know, contact with people, it has been hard, you know, and I think it's the Latina on me, you know, I need hugs and kisses and touching, you know, but you know, I'm just doing well. I'm very grateful to have food, to be able to work from home, to be able to still do the things that I like to do at home. So I'm grateful for what I have, you know, which is much more than many other people.
Great. I'm glad that you're able to find ways to balance your needs or to figure out how to meet your needs in this moment. I think it's kind of everyone's trying to figure out how to live in a world that's contained.
Yeah.
So I wanted to just talk to you first of all about what you're seeing the impacts of COVID-19 on sex workers. You work and know and care about the intersections of trans issues, immigrations issues, race. What in that intersection right now of all those issues, how is COVID-19 playing out amongst sex workers?
It has been terrible, Imara. I wish I could tell you, give you like a better outcome. It has been terrible. Like, you know, when we talk about trans people, specifically mostly trans women who are Latinas and may or may not be undocumented, that specific intersection is really, really hard when their job is trading sex for money or whatever they do trade for. Because most of these communities either have like ads online or do a specific like street work. And, those two things require an actual contact in between the sex worker and the client. And at this time, those are not things that we are allowed to do or we are safe while doing. So because of that, this community has been hit like really, really, really hard. And we see it firsthand. I've been working with Colectivo Cultural Transgrediendo, which you may know that, we lost Lorena Borjas, but the work didn't end with her death. We have to continue taking care of all her girls. And the requests go from I need to pay my phone to I need to pay my rent to I need my medication to I am going bananas. It's so many requests.
And one of the things that you mentioned or have mentioned in the past is how the needs are severe. But for some people, it may not seem like a lot of money. So you were saying, for instance, that people are trying to raise $200 a month to meet their rent, that they're trying to just get $50 at a time to buy groceries. I mean, those are what the needs are, right?
Exactly. When I've been working with Liam, who is the new interim director of Colectivo Cultural Transgrediendo. And when she told me like, oh, we have like 20 girls that need to pay the rent, I was like, how we're gonna get that money? But then she explained to me like, these girls like rent rooms in people's homes. So, the rents are not in the thousands. The rents are like $300, $250, So for that, we've been trying to manipulate to the best of our ability some of the funds that we had there and trying to ask philanthropy for more money. So sometimes like the needs are not really big numbers when it comes to money. Like you need to pay your phone. What is it, like $50? We started doing that. Do you need money to go to the supermarket? Instead of like choosing what food we could send them, we decided to do gift cards of $50 so they could go to the supermarket and get whatever they need. So if you think the needs are many, but some of those needs do not involve like huge numbers of money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned Lorena Borjas. One of the things that she did right before she passed, of course, was to create a fund designed to help the people that you are talking about. So it just underscores how important that work is. I'm wondering, do you think then, given the extreme economic impact and dislocation, the fact that you're talking about that $50, $200 can make a massive difference in the lives of these women, what impact would decriminalization or legalization have on these women in this moment, do you think, in terms of making a difference in their lives?
Well, I have to tell you that, one of the things that have happened in between all this madness that I am happy about is like we have seen some really important steps toward decriminalization. I don't know if you know, but a lot of trans people have been released from Rikers Island in the last 30 days. So, you know, that is a wonderful thing. In the middle of all of these is still a great thing. You know, I think like we are actually going to be in a better space to talk about decriminalization after COVID. And I think it would be a great opportunity to push, you know, to decriminalize not just sex work, but many things. When it comes to legalization, and thank you for bringing it up, because sometimes people, you know, don't really make a difference between decriminalization and legalization. I always talk about decriminalization because when we talk about legalization, usually legalization doesn't include folks who are not citizens of this country or residents of this country. Usually legalization doesn't involve people who are undocumented. And for that, when we talk about legalization, we have to make sure that we talk legalization in a way that includes everybody, because otherwise it could be detrimental for my community in this case.
Right, right. I think, you know, what you said before is that you would be for legalization if legalization meant everyone in terms of sex work, but the fact that it doesn't include undocumented immigrant women makes it not fair, right, fundamentally, whereas decriminalization does apply to everyone.
Decriminalization applies for everyone, you know. This community, you know, Imara, you know, has always have it like, you know, the worst, like, you know, in this, you know, if we look at, you know, this situation, like, you know, this woman won't be getting a stimulus check. You know, this woman cannot apply for unemployment. You know, this woman, you know, don't have you know, customers who are gonna just call them and say like, do you need something? Do you need anything? You know, I wish, but you know, it is a hard situation. It is a really, really hard situation.
Yeah, and I think you know, that's one of the things that is possible under, you know, there are all these ways to decriminalize, right? If decriminalization can apply to everyone, there are all these ways to decriminalize. So you could make it so that these women are able to be, you know, as in Las Vegas or in Holland, independent contractors. So, you know, technically under the law, they could file for these stimulus programs. They could file for small business. They could have access to all these things that can make a dramatic difference. But because it's criminalized, it's totally blocked off.
Yeah, and you know, and decriminalization, you know, is sending this, you know, woman to jail. We're like, you know, why? Why? If you are an adult and the sex that you are exchanging is consensual, you should not be criminalized for it. You know, that's my take. Like, you know, consensual exchange of sex for anything should never be criminalized.
Right. On that point of, you know, being jailed for consensual exchange of sex, you're on the steering committee, as we mentioned in our intro, of Decrim New York, which is a coalition of sex workers, former sex workers, and allies who are working to decriminalize sex work in New York. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the major priorities in terms of legal changes that you're pushing for. I know one of the things that we came across in our research is how there's a condom law in the state, for example, so that possession of a condom is legal grounds to be arrested on sex work, which is one of the more absurd ones. But I'm wondering, what are the ones that you're most focused on?
And I, you know, of course, like, you know, they always define you know, goal. It would be to fully decriminalize the exchange of sex. But at this point, we really had to prioritize what is called walking while trans, which is the fact that police officers are able to arrest a woman, and in my case, like trans woman, just for being, right? A police officer, let's say you and me are talking in a corner, a police officer can come and say that we are loitering for purposes of prostitution, regardless if we are or we are not. That is at their discretion, right? So loitering is a really, really damaging piece of legislation that needs to be changed. We are really focusing on changing that. And, it took the name of Walking While Trans because these oppressive legislation and these laws really affect mostly trans women, trans Latinas, trans sex workers. But just to say, this is a piece of legislation that doesn't just affect sex workers. Police can come and arrest you or I because they may understand that we're loitering. So that's
right.
one of the most important points in the legislative agenda, and we're really hopeful that we are able to change and that. And about the condoms, like yeah, in the state, some having more than 2 or 3 condoms can be taken as a leverage to say that you are doing sex work. And that's how I met Lorena. She would go Roosevelt Avenue up and down giving condoms, so all the girls would have like 2, but never more than 2. She was amazing.
Wow. One of the questions that we actually have received is from the National Center for Transgender Equality, interestingly, and they're asking, and it's pertinent given what you just mentioned about Lorena and your own activism, is that for advocates of decriminalization who are outside of places like New York with networks, what do you recommend in terms of how people can come together to advocate for these changes?
In my experience, and I've been trying to, and I've been working in this sphere for a long time, but I am a huge believer on coalition work. I really believe that coming together with all the parts that take a place into the big picture of sex work and sex workers has a much better impact, right? Cis women, trans women, cis men, non-binary sex workers, undocumented, documented, street workers, escorts, camp workers, dancers. So, having a coalition approach that involves everybody who may engage in the sex trade has a much better result. Like, after creating Decrim New York as a coalition, we really went really fast, really quick. We were able to draft legislation, introduce it in the Assembly, introduce it in the Senate. Still didn't pass. It's going to take a long time. But, coalition work, in my opinion, is much more effective.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for that advice, for your work, for your commitment, and for the time that you gave us today. Really, really, really appreciate it, and continue to find ways to take care of yourself in this moment.
Thank you. I am always happy to be whatever you ask me to be. I am a huge fan of you and your work. Thank you for all you do. And let's keep going. We are unstoppable.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I love people who are willing to do anything that I ask. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day and evening. You have just heard from Cecilia Gentili. From our interview earlier today, Cecilia is on the steering committee of Decrim New York and is a principal at Transgender Equity Consulting. I'm Imara Jones, and you are watching Lives at Stake. Now, in addition to many of the economic concerns that Cecilia raised, she also touched upon those dealing with the intersection of sex work and criminal justice. That's why we are now going to speak with Toni-Michelle Williams, who is the Executive Director of Solutions Not Punishment Collaborative, SNAPCO, in Atlanta, Georgia, an organization of sex workers, former sex workers, and allies who are fighting to end the prison industrial complex. Toni-Michelle Williams, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I don't know if I'm going to get through this interview by not saying your whole name. The first thing that I wanted to ask you, as we're doing everyone in this moment, is how are you getting through the present time?
My honest answer is that I have a quarantine boo bae group, and my boo bae group is just a group of my bestest friends. It's a small group of us, about 4 of us, and being able to talk to my friends each day over the phone because everybody has time, and having long conversations with my mom in ways that we haven't before. It just sets a different tone in family and in love and in life, the life that we have. So I've been really just being present with that, and it's been keeping me going.
When you said that you had a boo-bae group, I thought it was another type of situation. I'm glad that you clarified.
No,
I was like, this is not that kind of show, but I want to ask a whole lot of questions about it. But we're gonna move on. My first question is, why is the into mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex such a focus of trans people and trans organization in Atlanta?
Yeah. Well, the path toward criminal justice reform and ending mass incarceration in Atlanta really began in 2013 when trans, cis, het, queer folk in Atlanta came together to respond to a city ordinance that was proposed by the city of Atlanta and a group of rich white gays in Midtown to banish women, particularly Black trans women, who were engaging in sex work in that area. And so we have been committed to criminal justice reform since then by reclassifying marijuana laws, ending cash bail, and most recently with our amazing, fierce collaborators, the Racial Justice Action Center, Women on the Rise, by shutting down, closing, and repurposing the Atlanta City Detention Center.
Mm-hmm. What are specifically kind of the policies and practices that you're most concerned about in terms of changing the way that criminal justice works for trans people? I think, as I mentioned earlier, Cecilia spoke about, walking around trans laws here in New York, the number of condoms being, a reason to be able to arrest people. I'm wondering, what are some of the laws and policies that you're concerned about there in Atlanta and in Georgia?
Yeah, so SNAPCO, I heard you talking about decrim versus legalization earlier. And so SNAPCO really demands that Atlanta expunges all sex workers of prostitution charges and decriminalize all forms of sex work, right? Particularly for Black, trans, and queer people. And what that currently looks like is repealing the current city ordinance of solicitation and loitering laws. Also, we really need a commitment from police, APD, and surrounding police officers to cease all stings and raids, right? And really deprioritize arrests for sex workers in the ways that we deprioritized arrests for the reclassification of marijuana in 2017. And so that's what we're primarily focused on right now. The repealing of solicitation is something that has been, the other offering when we first came together back in 2013 outside of the pre-arrest diversion initiative, right? We knew that folks just don't need to be in cages. And so that's our primary focus right now. While we have the City of Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms' attention around and commitment around LGBTQ issues, around HIV issues and criminalization laws, we want to make sure that she's hearing about the lives and experiences of sex workers and Black children.
Just one note, Toni-Michelle, I don't know if your phone is beeping. Maybe it's your Bay Collective. But we just want to make you aware of that.
Well, shout out to them. Thank you. I'm putting everybody on
it's the evening. It's the evening, so you might be getting hit up. Seriously though, Atlanta is a locus for sex trafficking in the United States, and I'm wondering how you answer people who say that that decriminalization perhaps opens the door to an expansion of sex trafficking, which is why we shouldn't decriminalize sex work.
Yeah, my response is always either with a grand, very Southern belle, graceful tight teeth, or just a simple look of disgust. And I may say something like, oh, baby, you're delusional. But seriously, we know that these two are not the same thing and and the solutions to these issues can happen at the same time. And when we are fighting for bringing awareness to the exploitation of our folks, right? We are talking about our community being grounded in rights and the autonomy of our bodies and our choices and the empowerment of being able to show up in leadership to challenge those elected officials and to demand and participate and mold the culture shift that we're dreaming of and talking about.
And lastly, we actually have a question from La Para Latinas in San Francisco for you, which is, how do we go about building a coalition amongst Black and Brown people to tackle the issues of mass incarceration and how they intersect with sex work?
Yeah. There are two things I want to offer. One is that we talk about this all the time around organizations and people across experience and identity coming together to fight against a cause, and how hard that is, right? How yucky it could feel to be erased, or that sometimes, oppression Olympics shows up in the ways that we advocate for ourselves. And I believe that we have been doing that. We've been in collaboration and in alliance with each other and in support of each other. I think that you bring your friends together. You bring the girls who are most impacted, and y'all study together, and y'all practice together, and show up in spaces together, take over spaces together, have strategy, have purpose and intention, and in plan. And I think that grouping of folk who are like-minded and who support the cause, I think that what is the quality of a powerful coalition that we hope for and dream for.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that positive note, how to come together, I want to thank you, Toni-Michelle Williams, for joining us tonight and for all of your incredibly brave work that you and SNAPCO does in Atlanta, in the heart of the South. And just have a wonderful evening, and we will continue to follow your work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. You have been listening to the one, the only Toni-Michelle Williams, who is Executive Director of Solutions, Not Punishment Collaborative, SNAPCO, in Atlanta, Georgia. I am Imara Jones, and you are watching Lives at Stake. Well, finding these issues together of economic insecurity, educational issues, and also mass incarceration is the push to decriminalize sex work. Here in New York, that is being led by New York State Senator Jessica Ramos of Queens, the 13th District of Queens. As a matter of fact, her district also happens to be the epicenter of the epicenter of the coronavirus crisis. And tonight she's actually leading a town hall meeting to discuss that issue. But she joined us earlier today to talk about why decriminalization of sex work is such a pivotal issue for her, who is a cis woman who is not a sex worker nor of sex worker backgrounds. Senator Ramos, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Imara. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Before we unpack the issues around the legislation that you're sponsoring, centered on decriminalization of sex work in New York, I wanted to just ask you how you are doing and how your district is doing, given that it's the epicenter of the virus in the country.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. It has been an incredible ordeal. We are just in the middle of the medical crisis. Elmhurst Hospital is here in our district. We are losing more loved ones than anyone else in New York. And of course, as we know, New York has more deaths than almost any other place on the planet. And so aside from that, we are in dire need of food and services for our people. And of course, because we're so diverse here, we really need lots of different resources and language access. So there's a lot of work to do with all of our populations. We want to make sure we're being as inclusive as possible. But I have to tell you, I live 2 blocks away from the hospital. I hear the sirens all day. It's become the soundtrack for the pandemic for me. And that, I think, is taking quite a toll on us, but we have to be strong. We have to stay united. It's the only way we're going to get out of this is together.
Right. Well, I hope that you are able to get the help that you need from your colleagues in the state legislature and from the state government and hopefully from the federal government to alleviate some of that suffering. And, you know, our hearts go out to you, and many of us in New York have experienced the same thing. So thank you for letting us know what your situation is. I wanted to ask you, when it comes to the issue of sex work, what made you decide to put your political capital behind a piece of legislation to decriminalize sex work in New York? It is an issue that many political leaders would not necessarily rally around, and I'm curious as to what brought you to this point.
Yeah, so I am born and raised in my district. I have seen sex workers my entire life. And so to me, it has always been very clear that they are my neighbors too. And so because they exist, and I am pledging to serve the public, well, then that means all of the public. And I have to make sure that I'm working with all of the different communities to make sure that they're protected and that they feel safe. And that is of particular interest to me. I chair the labor committee in the state Senate. That's where my background is in labor and in thinking about workers' rights and how that can be improved. And so, of course, I want to make sure that my neighbors are getting their money. I want to make sure that my neighbors are able to access healthcare and other things that we might not think about when it comes to sex work, but actually are exactly the most important things in protecting people. And that's the thing about the sex trades. My other interest, of course, is in reducing human trafficking. But that, you know, sex work is not all the same. People are in sex work because, yes, maybe they were coerced, but also because of circumstance, because of choice. And so we need to make sure that the overarching goal is that we're keeping everyone safe and we're empowering them to report violence against them. So what we're really promoting is workers' rights and safe sex.
You touched upon the issue of trafficking, which I want to come back to in a minute, but what are some of the ways in which decriminalization will help you think most fundamentally your constituents? As we mentioned in the introduction, You have the highest number of trans people in your district, of any district in the country. What are some of the ways in which they can be helped? Because as we know, coronavirus is doing two things to the community. One, it's cutting off income, and two, it's criminalization makes it impossible for people to get access to government help. So what are the key things you think are included that will make the biggest difference in the lives of sex workers?
Yeah, right now, as you can imagine, sex workers are out of work, and they are largely transgender, although not limited to. The common belief is that they're women or transgender. No, there are male sex workers as well. And we want to make sure that they have access to food. And well, as May 1st draws nigh, we're all worried about rent. So we're continuing to advocate for things that we need at the state level, to the governor, to the legislature. We're working hard. I've proposed a worker bailout that would cover anybody who is a worker. And I made sure that I included language that does not discriminate against what it is that you do. The point is that if you work for a living, you should be able to get $3,300 a month if we're able to tax billionaires' capital gains. That's all I'm asking to do. And that would cover $3,300 a month per worker per month for the duration of this pandemic. And I think it's the responsible thing to do so that we can have somewhat of a cushion when we're ready to reopen the economy fully and everything doesn't come to a crash.
Mm-hmm. In what ways would decriminalization bring sex workers into the economy more and being able to mainstream and access services as citizens, as workers? What impact would decriminalization have on that?
I think it's all those things, and overall just dignity. We don't want anyone to feel cast aside in our society. We know that when we push things into the shadows and they become clandestine, we know less about them. Bad things start to happen, worse things start to happen, and then we've completely lost control. We don't want that to happen with human beings. We want people to feel protected. So in doing so, we want to make sure that they have a means to provide for themselves, and that they, again, have access to guaranteed healthcare. It's why we're fighting for single payer for everyone. And that would include transitional services and other hormonal or other services that anybody might need. We wanted to make sure to be very inclusive there too. And same thing with the rights at work. We passed Gender last year to make sure that people can't be discriminated at their workplace for their gender identity. And so we want to continue to fight for these protections. And we want to make sure that we're getting people off the streets and able to survive and hopefully thrive once this calamity is over.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify for people, GENDA is the Gender Equality Non-Discrimination Act that was passed. So I wanted to come back to the issue of trafficking. How do you answer your critics that I would imagine would come from two directions? What do you say to those people who worry that decriminalization would lead to an increase in trafficking? And then what do you say to people who say, no, decriminalization doesn't go far enough, we need full legalization? How do you respond to those questions?
Yeah, the reason I support the decriminalization model is because I believe in trusting the worker. I believe in trusting a person's autonomy over their body and making sure that they're able to do with it as they please, as long as they're not hurting anyone else. And so, I may not agree, then I don't participate. But if you want to participate, you should be able to go and do that safely somewhere. That's part of the freedoms that we have, right? And our job is to protect each other. Again, the problem with legalization is that it's a model that can offer lots of profit for third parties or for people who might act as intermediaries between the buyer and the seller. And so again, it's about removing exploitation that may be possible in that work scenario, and actually empowering the worker. And then the Nordic model, or the end demand model, is really problematic to me. This is a model that only wants to legalize the selling of sex, but not the buying of sex. And the problem with this is that then that means that there is no incentive for the customer to give their real name and contact information to the sex worker. So how are they going to report violence against them? You can't screen your customers. And in neighborhoods like mine, where our undocumented population is high, and they seek those services, well, we don't want to put them in harm's way through law enforcement and end up in deportation proceedings just because of their bodily needs. These are things that I think we need to really think about and be fair when we consider a person's rights. And ultimately, you know, in the same way that we as women say all the time that we're pro-choice because it's our body and you know, our voice, and to me, it's the same thing for sex work. It's your body. Nobody should tell you what to do with it. I just want to make sure that whatever it is that you're doing with it is safe, that you're not harming yourself or anyone else.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about decriminalization as a way to prevent exploitation from both sides, right? Because your argument is that sex trafficking is a form of exploitation, and what we can do with decriminalization is to end that by allowing reporting and a whole host of other things, ownership of the work by women, et cetera. And then also, I hadn't thought about the fact that legalization could lead to this exploitation by third parties. I even thought about it could be on the marijuana model, where you start to have corporations or these large cross-party states. So it's complex. What are the chances, given the complexities, what are the chances you think of this passing the Senate? Does it have support? Is it gaining momentum from your colleagues?
I think that we've done a great job of starting our public education of this topic, along with the main sponsor of this bill, my colleague, Julia Salazar from Brooklyn. We've been working really hard to get out there with the Decrim New York Coalition, because this is a worker-led movement that we want to get out there and kind of brush out the cobwebs, you know, from underneath the rug, because we got to talk about this. It's been going on since the beginning of the human race. It's called the oldest profession for a reason. And I know it's taboo, and I know it can be hard to talk about, but shoving it under the rug hasn't done us any good. We've lost people who potential could have been great for the rest of society. We want to make sure that we're doing what's right by everyone.
One last question. What's really clear is how one of the things that allows you to look at this to a certain degree as you would any labor issue is because you have a lack of stigmatization around sex work, and you're able to see sex workers as human beings. I'm wondering, what do you think, what advice would you give to people who still have those barriers, around stigmatization of sex work and sex workers, to help them be able to see it as you do?
Well, I usually share a little story of what happened to me. So I was probably I was 20, 21, and I was coming back from Manhattan with some of my girlfriends in the middle of the summer. And we were wearing short skirts and shorts, and we looked cute. And the precinct stopped us on Roosevelt Avenue and 75th Street because they thought we were working the street. And, you know, few of my girlfriends were carrying condoms on them. And of course, those can be used as evidence if you have more than two of trading sex. Well, we all got stopped and frisked because it was the Bloomberg era, and that's what was done. And it was the most humiliating experience in my life. And honestly, no one should ever have to go through that. I don't care what it is that they do for a living. Everyone has dignity. Everyone has value. And to me, you know, and this is why I ran for office largely, and I get to see the diversity of absolutely everything. I even have millionaires in my district to contradict all of this, right? we want to make sure that public policy actually reflects what the needs of all of these different pockets of people are, because that way we're all able to lead a better life. And I know that might sound idealistic, but I don't think it's impossible. It just might be hard, and I'm not daunted by the task.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. I think that in so many ways it doesn't sound pie in the sky. It sounds incredibly wise, especially given this moment. I think one of the things that we are learning is that we are all in this together, and that the more we realize that, the better off we are. So I want to thank you for your passion, your leadership, and the skill that you bring to this particular issue. And of course, I'm sending the best to you and your district in a wrenching and very excruciating time for us all. And again, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. My best to you and to everyone who's listening. Thanks again for having me. And hopefully we'll be able to see each other in person soon.
I hope so. Thank you so much.
Bye.
You have just heard from New York State Senator Jessica Ramos, who is chair of the labor community and sponsor of Stop the Violence in Sex Trade Act to decriminalize sex work across New York State. Incidentally, her district has more transgender people than any other district in the United States. She's also asked that we share with you 2 organizations to be able to contribute to sex workers that have been impacted heavily by COVID-19 in her district. Of course, we mentioned that her district is the epicenter of the coronavirus in the United States. One is Colectivo Intercultural Transgrediendo, and the other one is the Lorena Bojas Community Fund. So those are also posted right now in our feed, and you can link to those organizations to figure out how you can help. You are watching Lives at Stake, and I am Imara Jones. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have tonight. This is such a broad issue that we've only scratched the surface in the little more than an hour that we have been together, but we hope that we've been able to illuminate a critical issue that you wouldn't have thought about or may not have even heard about before, or if you have, that you wish got more airtime, which we did tonight. So please continue to follow the people and the organizations that you heard about tonight in order to learn more about the decriminalization effort of sex work in the United States and why it is so important in light of the coronavirus. We also wanted to sign out tonight, recognizing that it is the beginning of Ramadan. That spirit of reflection and peace and community are ones that we need now more than ever. So much so that I did my own little bit emoji, urged by the WNYC Green Space and Translash teams earlier today, to mark and commemorate the event. And so we wish all those who mark Ramadan with peace and strength through the next month, because you got to go all day without eating. Again, I am Imara Jones. You have been watching Lives at Stake. Join us next month on May 28th for our next topic, which we'll just keep a secret until later. And you'll have to follow us online and sign up for our newsletters, like I told you to do, at translash.org and thegreenspace.org to find out exactly what it is. Be safe, be well, and we'll see you in a month.